My daughter-in-law held one of my grandmother's quilts up between two fingers, pinched like something she had found behind the refrigerator, and she said, "Odessa, honey, we cannot keep hauling these old rags from house to house." The dining room went quiet. My son studied his coffee, and I let her believe those rags were worthless, because I was the only person at that table who knew that the name stitched into the backing would one day be read aloud in a museum. I want to say her name plainly, so you understand exactly who did this. Camille, my son Terrence's wife, married into my family 11 years ago, and from the first Sunday she sat at my table, she had a way of looking at everything I owned as if she were pricing it for a yard sale. I was 71 years old that morning. I had raised Terrence mostly alone after his father passed, worked 34 years as a fabric buyer for a department store downtown, and I had carried my grandmother's quilts through 4 moves, 2 floods, and 1 house fire that took almost everything else I owned. And there was Camille, in her cream silk blouse, holding the oldest thing my family had, calling it a rag. What Camille did not know, what none of them knew that morning, was that the row of faded names and dates hand-stitched into the backing of that top quilt was a documented record older than the state we were sitting in, and before this story was over, a woman from a museum was going to lay that quilt on a lighted table, read those names out loud, one by one, and turn everything Camille believed about who mattered in this family completely upside down. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had someone you loved look at the most precious thing you owned and call it garbage? Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I read every comment, and I promise you this story is going somewhere. Now let me take you back to that morning, because it did not start with the quilts. It started with a phone call about a house. The call came on a Tuesday in early spring. Terrence's voice was careful, the voice he used when Camille had already decided something, and he was calling to make it sound like a conversation. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking, and we think it's time you moved in with us. The stairs at your place, the driveway in winter, it's just not safe anymore." I was standing in my kitchen with a dish towel over my shoulder. Outside the window, the crab apple tree my late husband planted was just starting to bud. I had lived in that house for 29 years, and I will not pretend otherwise. Part of me was grateful, because the truth was the stairs had gotten harder, and the winters longer, and the silence of that house since Elias died had a weight to it I did not always want to carry alone. So I said yes. I told my son I would come. What I did not understand, standing there with the phone against my ear and the spring light coming in soft and gold, was that Camille had not planned a move. She had planned an editing. She was going to go through my whole life, item by item, and decide what was allowed to follow me into her clean, beige, catalog perfect house, and what was going to be quietly carried to the curb. The move happened over 2 weekends in April. Terrence rented a truck. My grandson Julian, who was 19 and gentle, and the only one of them who ever asked me questions and actually waited for the answers, did most of the lifting. And Camille supervised. That is the only word for what she did. She stood in the middle of my emptying rooms with a clipboard, and she made a small sound in her throat every time she picked up something she considered beneath her house. "We have plenty of dishes," she said, and my mother's willow pattern plates went into a box marked "Donate." "This is water-stained," she said, and the cedar hope chest my father built with his own hands went out to the porch. I said very little. I have found, over 71 years, that saying little is often the strongest thing a woman can do in a room full of people who have already decided she is finished. I watched my life get sorted into keep, sell, and give away, and I kept my hands folded, and I waited. Because there was one thing in that house I was not going to let her touch, and I was waiting to see how she would handle it. The Quilts lived in the cedar chest, the one she had just banished to the porch. There were 7 of them. 7 quilts, folded and layered and separated by sheets of acid-free tissue that I replaced every few years, a habit my grandmother taught me and her grandmother taught her. When Julian carried the chest back inside at my request, and I lifted the lid, Camille came over to look, and I saw her face do the thing I had been dreading. It curdled. Polite disgust, the kind she thought she was hiding. "Oh," she said, "what are these?" "They're quilts," I said. "They belonged to my grandmother. And her grandmother before that." Camille reached in and lifted the top one, and I felt something tighten in my chest, because she held it wrong, by one corner, so that the whole weight of it dragged and the old threads pulled. "They smell like a basement," she said, wrinkling her nose. She turned to Terence. "Honey, these are falling apart. There are stains. This one has a hole. We are not putting these in the guest room. I just redid that room." "They're my grandmother's," I said again, quietly. "I understand that," Camille said, in the tone people use right before they explain to you why understanding something does not mean respecting it. "But Odessa, we have to be realistic. You cannot keep every single thing. These are old rags. They've had their time. I have a beautiful storage solution planned. But there is a limit. And honestly," she let the quilt fold back down into the chest carelessly, so that a corner flopped over the edge and touched the floor. "These belong in a donation bin, or, honestly, the trash. I'll be gentle about it. But we need to let some things go." Old rags. That was the phrase. She said it twice that April, and she would say it again in front of company, and each time she said it I felt my grandmother's hands in mine, guiding a needle, and I said nothing, because here is what Camille did not know, and what I am going to tell you now, so that you understand the full weight of what she was calling garbage. My grandmother's name was Cordelia. She was born in the last decade before the turn of the century, and she raised me after my own mother died young. In a small frame house with a wood stove and a good north window she called her sewing window, and the quilts in that chest were not made by Cordelia. They were made before her, by her grandmothers and their sisters, and the women of their church and their community, going back further than any photograph we owned. Cordelia used to lay the oldest one across her knees in the evening and run her finger along the stitching on the back, along a row of small, careful letters, and she would say names to me like a prayer. She never told me exactly what the names were. She told me only this: "Odessa, these are our people. When you don't know where you come from, you lay your hand on this, and you'll know somebody thought you were worth writing down." I could not grasp, when I was small, that she meant it literally. I thought it was a way of speaking. It was not until I was much older, and Cordelia had been gone for years, that I began to wonder about that row of stitched names, and by then I had no one left to ask. So I kept them. Through the flood in the year Terence was born, when I carried the chest up to the attic myself with my belly out to here, through the house fire 9 years later that started in a neighbor's wall and took my kitchen and my good sofa and most of my photographs, but not the chest, because I ran back in for it, and Elias never forgave himself for letting me, and I never once regretted it. Through the years of raising a boy alone on a fabric buyer's salary, when selling them would have been so easy, and a woman came to my church once and offered me $200 for the lot, because she thought they'd look primitive and charming over her stair rail, and I told that woman they were not for sale, not for 200, not for 2,000, not for anything. And now here was Camille, calling them rags. I did not fight her that April. That is important for you to understand, because I know how it looks. It looks like I let her win. But I know by now that there is a difference between losing and waiting, and the difference is whether you know something the other person does not. So when Camille declared that the quilts could not go in her redone guest room, I said, in my mildest voice, "That's all right. I'll keep them in a box in the garage. They won't be in anyone's way." Camille was delighted. She had expected a fight, an old woman clutching her rags, and instead she got graceful surrender, which cost her nothing and made her feel generous. "That's a perfect compromise," she said, and she actually patted my hand. "See, Terence? Your mother is being so reasonable." Reasonable. I let her have the word. And that night, in the small room they had given me in their house, the room that smelled of fresh paint and somebody else's idea of tasteful, I sat at the corner of a borrowed bed, and I made a decision. I would find out, finally, what those names said. Not for Camille. For Cordelia. For the grandmother who told me somebody once counted me worth a name. I just did not yet know that finding out was going to cost Camille everything she thought she had over me. I have to describe the house I had moved into, because you cannot understand what came next without understanding what Camille had built. Terence and Camille lived in a new development on the good side of town, in a house with 2 staircases and a kitchen island the size of my first apartment. Everything in it was chosen. Nothing in it was inherited. Camille was proud of this. She said it more than once, in company, as if it were a virtue. "I don't do clutter," she would say. "I don't do sentimental. If something doesn't earn its place, it goes." And people would nod, because Camille was beautiful and confident, and she said things like that with a smile that made you feel a little cluttered and sentimental yourself. Camille had a project that year, and the project was our family tree. That is the part that still makes me shake my head. She had gotten interested in genealogy like she got interested in everything, all at once and very publicly. And she had spent, by Terence's uncomfortable admission, close to $4,000 on a service that built you a laminated wall chart and mailed you a certificate. She had discovered, or believed she had discovered, that Terence's family, my family, had distinguished roots. She had found a name she liked 3 generations back and attached great meaning to it. She had begun to introduce herself, at her club and her charity committee, as having married into an old family with a real heritage. And here is the thing that I bit my tongue about for weeks. The family Camille was so proud of marrying into, the heritage she put on a laminated chart and bragged about at her luncheons, was the exact same family whose handmade quilts she had just called rags and shoved into my garage. She was proud of the names. She just did not know she had the names, stitched in thread, sitting in a cardboard box beside the lawnmower. I knew. I did not say, because I had learned something in 34 years of buying fabric for other people to profit from. And it was this. Information is only power in the hands of the person who understands when to use it. I want to tell you about Julian now, my grandson. Because in a story full of people who did not see me, he was the one who did. Julian was 19. In his first year at the community college, studying something with computers I could never quite follow. And he had his grandfather Elias's quiet, watchful way about him. The morning after the second load of the move, while Camille was at her yoga and Terence was at the office, Julian found me in the garage. I had the box open, and one of the quilts unfolded across 2 sawhorses, and I was bent over the backing with a magnifying glass and a flashlight, trying to read a row of thread that time had faded almost into the fabric. "Grandma," he said, "what are you doing out here?" I could have made something up. Instead, I told him the truth. I said, "Julian, when I was your age, your great-great-grandmother used to read me names off the back of this quilt like a Bible verse. and I never learned what they said. And I am 71 years old, and I have decided I am going to find out before I die, and I don't much care if your stepmother thinks it's foolish." Julian did not laugh. He came and stood beside me and looked at the row of tiny stitches, brown on brown, and he was quiet a good while. Then he said, "Can you even read that? It's so faded." "Some of it," I said. "Not all. My eyes aren't what they were." And Julian, God bless that boy, said, "There's a way to do this. You can photograph it in raking light and enhance the contrast. They do it with old documents. There are people, professionals, who do exactly this." He looked at me. "Do you want me to find out who does that?" Understand what that moment was for me. I had spent April being sorted, priced, and dismissed. I had watched my father's chest go to the porch and my mother's plates go to donate, and I had held my tongue until it ached. And here was this boy, this 19-year-old with his grandfather's eyes, treating my grandmother's quilt not as a rag, but as a document, as something with names in it worth reading. "Yes," I said, "I want you to find out." That was the beginning. Not a lawyer, not a will, not a bank account. A boy with a phone and an old woman with a magnifying glass, in a garage that smelled of gasoline, deciding that the names were worth reading. Everything that happened to Camille after that, everything, started right there. And she never saw it coming, because she was at yoga. Now, before I go on, I have to be fair to you and to the story, and tell you that I did not know, that morning in the garage, what we were going to find. I will be plain about that. I did not have a secret certainty that the quilts were treasure. What I had was Cordelia's voice, and a row of names, and a refusal to let Camille be the last word on what my family was worth. If it had turned out that the names were just names, ordinary people, no museum, no reckoning, I would have loved that quilt exactly the same. I need you to know that, because the story is about to give Camille a comeuppance she richly earned, and I do not want you to think I did any of it for spite. I did it for Cordelia. The reckoning was Camille's own doing. I only brought the lamp to it. Julian was as good as his word. Within a week he had found 3 names. The first was a fabric conservator 2 hours away who wanted $600 just to look. The second was a woman who did vintage textile appraisals out of an antique mall and, when Julian described the quilts over the phone, said the word shabby chic and quoted us a price to buy them, which told me everything I needed to know about her. And the third was a name Julian read off a museum website, a woman who ran the textile collection at the State Historical Society, whose specialty was listed as 19th century American quilts and the documentation of communities through textile. Documentation of communities through textile. I read that line 3 times. It was as if someone had reached back 60 years and translated Cordelia for me. These are our people. Somebody once counted them worth a name. Her name was Eleanor Ashe. And getting Eleanor Ashe to look at my quilts was going to take me the whole summer, and it would unfold in Camille's own dining room, in front of Camille's own guests, and I could not have designed a more perfect stage if I had tried. But I am getting ahead of myself. I should show you how Camille made it worse first. Because she did. She always did. The dinner party was Camille's idea, of course. It was the middle of May, and she was hosting 6 couples from her charity committee, the kind of evening where the wine costs more than my monthly grocery bill and everyone pretends the food is a surprise, even though the caterer's van is still in the driveway. I offered to stay in my room. Camille would not hear of it, which surprised me, until I understood why. She wanted me there. She had a use for me. "Odessa will tell you all about the family," she announced to the table, over the first course, her hand on Terrence's arm. We come from real old stock. You know. I've traced it clear back to the start. There's a whole heritage here. And she looked at me, expecting me to perform, to be the quaint old grandmother who confirmed how distinguished her marriage was. A woman across the table, a thin woman with a gold watch, asked me, "How far back can you trace it, really?" And before I could answer, Camille laughed and said, "Oh, don't ask Odessa for documents. She's got a box of old rags in the garage she thinks is history." The table laughed with her. It was a light, easy laugh, the kind that does not know it has drawn blood. "No, I did the real research," Camille went on. "I have it all professionally charted. Odessa's more of a keepsakes person. Aren't you, Odessa?" I set down my fork. I looked at that whole polished table, at the candlelight and the good wine, and that thin woman in her gold watch, and I felt Cordelia stand up somewhere behind my ribs. And I said, very calmly, "The box in the garage isn't rags. It's 7 quilts, and the oldest of them has names and dates sewn into the back, by the very hands of the women who made them, going back before there were cameras to take a picture of any of us." I let that sit for a moment. So when you ask how far back I can trace it, Camille has a chart she bought. I have the actual thread those women pulled. The table went quiet in a different way than Camille's laugh had made it quiet. The woman with the gold watch leaned forward. "Names sewn into the back? You mean like a signature quilt?" I had not heard that term yet. I said, "I mean names. My grandmother read them to me." "Those can be extraordinary," the woman said. "There was one at auction, a documented one from before the war. It went for, $60,000. She was speaking to the table now, and I watched Camille's face while she said it. "The value isn't the fabric. It's the documentation. If it can be authenticated, a signature album quilt is a primary historical record. Museums fight over them. $60,000. I did not care about the number, and you must believe that of me. I have never once cared about the number, but I cared very much about Camille's face while she heard it. Because Camille cared about the number more than anything else in the world, and I watched her do the arithmetic, and I saw her realize that the rags she had shoved into the garage next to the lawnmower might be worth more than her laminated chart, her $4,000, and her whole performance of heritage combined. "Well," Camille said, recovering, "we don't actually know that they're anything. Odessa's grandmother could have made up anything. Old people misremember." She smiled at me, and the smile had a new edge in it. Because now I was a problem. But it's a sweet story. And there it was. The moment she went from dismissing the quilts to being frightened of them. That is the moment, if you have ever dealt with a person like Camille, that you learn to recognize. It is the moment they stop calling a thing worthless and start wanting to control it. That night, after the guests were gone and the caterer's van had pulled away, I heard them in the kitchen. I was not eavesdropping. The house carried sound, and my room was near the top of the back stairs. I heard Camille's voice, low and fast. "Terence, if those things are actually worth something, they should not be sitting in the garage. They're family assets. They should be handled properly. We should get them appraised, and we should probably keep them somewhere secure and honestly in trust for the children. Your mother is 71. She can't be responsible for something like that." And I heard my son, my Terence, say the thing that hurt worse than anything Camille had ever said, because Camille was a stranger who married in, but Terence was mine. He said, "You're right. We'll talk to her. They're really the family's, not just hers." Not just hers. 34 years I carried those quilts. Through the flood, through the fire I ran back into, and my own son stood in a kitchen that I was a guest in, and called them the family's. Not just mine, the moment they proved to be worth something. I did not cry. Let me say that clearly, because I know the picture you might have. The old woman crying alone in the borrowed room. I did not cry. I sat very still on the edge of that bed, and I felt something in me go quiet and clear and hard, the way a lake goes still before it freezes. And I made the second decision of that spring. The first had been to find out what the names said. The second was this: I was going to control exactly how, when, and in front of whom the truth about those quilts came out. Camille wanted to take them to some quiet appraiser, get a number and lock them in a vault for the children, which meant for her, she was not going to get that. If those names were going to be read, they were going to be read out loud, in the light, in front of everyone, by someone Camille could not argue with. And Camille was going to have to sit there and hear whose family it really was. I called Julian the next morning, on my own phone from the garage. That woman at the museum, I said. Eleanor Ashe. I want to write to her. Will you help me do it properly? Now I have to slow down and tell you the truth about how these things actually work, because this audience knows when a story cheats, and I will not cheat you. You do not simply call a museum curator and have her drop everything for an old woman with a box of quilts. Eleanor Ashe was the head of textiles for the state's historical collection. She had, Julian found out, a waiting list. She received, by her own later telling, dozens of letters a year from people certain that grandmother's quilt was a lost treasure, and almost every single time it was a lovely, ordinary 20th century quilt worth its weight in memory and nothing more. She was kind about it, but she was busy, and the odds of her coming to a private home were close to none. So Julian and I never sent her a plea. We sent her a photograph. Julian set up the quilt in the garage as he had read about, with a lamp raking low across the surface so the stitches threw tiny shadows, and he photographed the backing in sections. And then he did something on his computer to bring up the contrast, and for the very first time in my life, I saw those faded names come forward out of the cloth, like faces coming up out of dark water. I could not read all of them even then, but I could read some, and beside the names were dates. And those dates began back in 1852. We did not tell Eleanor Ashe it was a treasure. We simply sent her the clearest photograph, and Julian wrote, in careful words we drafted together at the kitchen table while Camille was out, a short letter that said, "My grandmother owns a quilt that has been in her family for at least 5 generations. The backing appears to contain hand-stitched names and dates beginning in the 1850s. We are not seeking an appraisal of monetary value. We would like to know if the people whose names are recorded here can be identified, because they are my grandmother's family, and she would like to know who they were before she dies. Any guidance you could offer would mean a great deal." Notice what that letter did not say. It did not beg. It did not brag. It did not mention money. It asked one honest question on behalf of one old woman about the names of women long gone. And I have learned that an honest question, asked plainly, will open doors that pleading never will. 3 weeks went by. Camille, in the meantime, had begun her campaign. She was not stupid. She did not seize the quilts. She was more careful than that. She began to talk, at dinner, in that reasonable voice about estate planning and getting the family's affairs in order. She left a brochure for a storage facility on my dresser, the climate-controlled kind, for the valuable textiles, Odessa to protect them. She suggested, gently, over and over, that the quilts should be properly appraised and insured, and she knew a man, a friend of a friend, who did estate appraisals and could handle everything. She wanted them out of my hands and into a process she controlled. And every time she raised it, Terence backed her. And every time I said the same mild thing, "I'll think about it. There's no rush." And I watched Camille grow more and more frustrated that the old woman would not simply hand over the box. Then the letter came back. Not from a secretary, from Eleanor Ashe herself, and it was 3 pages long, handwritten, and I have it still. She wrote that in 22 years of curatorial work, she had received a great many photographs of family quilts, and that this was one of perhaps 4 that had ever made her set down her coffee. She wrote that what we appeared to have was not simply a signature quilt, but possibly an album of signatures, a specific and rare form in which each block was made and inscribed by a different maker, and that the pattern of names, dates, and what looked like small inscriptions suggested it might be tied to a specific community, possibly a church or a mutual aid society in the years before the war. She wrote that if it was what it appeared to be, it was not a decorative object. It was a document. It was, in her exact words, a primary source in cloth, a census the census takers of that era would never have bothered to record, written by the very people history tried hardest to forget. And then she wrote the sentence that made me put the letter against my chest and sit down. She wrote, "Mrs. Whitfield, if you will permit me, I would be honored to come to you and read these names properly. In person, some things should not be examined in a laboratory before they are honored in a home." She wanted to come to us, to read the names out loud, in the home. I read that letter 4 times. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer of the nightstand in my borrowed room, and I began to plan. Because Eleanor Ashe had offered me the exact stage I had promised myself. And there was only one place, in that whole beautiful, chosen, inherited nothing house, where the reading was going to happen. It was going to happen at Camille's long walnut dining table, in Camille's dining room, in front of Camille's own eyes. And I would invite Camille herself to witness whose family it really was. But I did not tell Camille any of that. Not yet. I told her something else. I told her she had won. I went to her that same week, and I said, "Camille, you've been right. It's time I stopped being sentimental about the quilts. Let's have them properly looked at. Let's do it here, at the house, so it's dignified, and let's invite a few people so it's an occasion, and let's have a real expert do it, not some man from an antique mall." I watched her whole face light up. She thought she had worn me down. She thought she was about to get her appraisal, her number, her vault for the children. "I've already found the expert," I said. "She's willing to come here. I'll handle the invitation. You handle the room. You're so much better at the room than I am." Camille was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of thing she loved, an occasion, an audience, a chance to be the woman of heritage. "Oh, Odessa," she said. And she hugged me, actually hugged me, and I let her, "I'm so glad you've finally come around. We'll make it lovely. I'll invite the committee. This will be so good for us. For us." She was already imagining herself presiding over that table, presenting her heritage to her friends, with the quilts as her props, and me as her quaint, supporting character. She had no idea she had just invited a witness to her own undoing. She had booked the room, chosen the guests, and set the date for the exact afternoon that a curator from the historical collection was going to lay my grandmother's quilt on that walnut table, put on her white gloves, and read out the names of the women Camille had been bragging she descended from, and reveal to Camille's own friends that the woman who had called those names old rags did not even know she was surrounded by them. Now, while all of this was being arranged, something else was happening beyond my knowing until later, and I want to lay it out for you, honestly, because it matters. Camille had not given up on controlling the quilts. She had simply changed tactics. If she could not get me to hand them over quietly, she would make sure that whatever they turned out to be, she was positioned as the family's rightful steward of them. And so, in those weeks of planning the lovely occasion, Camille went and did two things behind my back. The first thing she did was call the man from the estate appraisal service anyway, the friend of a friend, and quietly ask him to come a few days before Eleanor Ashe, to get ahead of it. She wanted her own number, from her own man, so that whatever the museum woman said, Camille could say she had already had it handled. Julian found out about this because the man called the house and Julian answered, and the man, thinking Julian was the husband, spoke freely. He told Julian that Camille had asked him to appraise some old textiles and, more than that, to advise the family on transferring them into a trust to protect them from any elderly person issues. Elderly person issues. That was me. That was the whole game, laid bare on a phone call Camille never meant me to hear about. The second thing Camille did was worse, and it stayed hidden from me until the afternoon itself. But I will tell you now, so you carry it with you, as I wish I had. Camille, in her certainty that these quilts were about to be declared valuable, had already promised one of them to that thin friend who wore the gold watch. She had told her, over lunch, that the family would soon be rehoming some of the heritage textiles, and that of course her dear friend should have first pick. She had not owned a single one of those quilts for a single day in her life, and she was already handing them out to her friends like party favors. That is who Camille was. That is exactly who she was. I did not know the full extent of it. But I knew enough. I knew that Camille had booked an appraiser behind my back and was talking about trusts and elderly person issues, and I knew that whatever those quilts were, she intended to end up holding them. And so I did one more thing, one quiet, deliberate thing. Before the afternoon came, I made sure the quilts were legally, unmistakably, provably mine. Here is the lever, and this audience knows I have to show you the lever, or the whole story is just a wish. The quilts had come to me directly. My grandmother Cordelia had not left them to the family. She had left them to me, by name, in a short handwritten will she made in her last year, a single page witnessed by her pastor and a neighbor, in which she left my quilts and my sewing things to my granddaughter Odessa, who has hands for them. I had that page. I had kept it, folded, in the family Bible, for over 40 years. And in all of Camille's talk of the quilts belonging to everyone but me, she had never once asked whether there was any paper. There was paper. There had always been paper. The quilts were mine, in law, as plainly as anything is ever mine. Camille had built her whole strategy on the assumption that an old woman's things belong to whoever is strong enough to organize them. She never checked whose name was on the page. I did not wave that page around. I simply had it. I took it out of the Bible, and I made 2 clean copies, and I put the original in a safe deposit box at my own bank, in my own name, on a Tuesday morning that Camille believed I had spent at the doctor. And then I went home to the house that was not mine, and I helped Camille pick out linens for the lovely occasion. And I said nothing at all, because the strongest thing a woman can do among people who have already written her off is to know exactly where the paper is, and to let them keep believing there is none. I want to describe the days right before, because the waiting is its own kind of story. Camille was radiant with anticipation. She had invited 11 people, her whole committee and her thin gold-watched guest, and a man who wrote a little column about local society for a free paper, because Camille wanted it witnessed, and ideally written up. She had the caterer back. She had ordered flowers. She had, and I am not exaggerating, bought a new dress, a pale gold one, to match the occasion. She practiced, out loud, a little speech about the heritage of this family that she planned to give before the expert spoke. She asked me, twice, to not interrupt the flow, and to let the expert do her thing, and then let me frame it for everyone. She wanted me quiet. The quaint grandmother, sitting to the side, while Camille presented the family's heritage. I told her I would be as quiet as she liked. And I meant it. I did not need to speak. I had invited someone who was going to speak for me, and for Cordelia, and for every woman whose name was in that cloth. Julian was nervous for me. The night before, he sat with me in the garage while I did the thing I do when I am steadying myself, which is to lay the quilts out and check the tissue and refold them with clean hands. "Grandma," he said, "what if it's nothing? What if the museum lady comes and it's just, I don't know, ordinary?" Camille will be unbearable. I folded the corner of the oldest quilt over my hand. I could feel, through the cotton, the slight raised texture where the names had been worked into the cloth, a braille of the dead. "Julian," I said, "I have loved this quilt for 70 years without knowing its worth to anybody but me. If tomorrow it proves worthless to the rest of the world, I will love it exactly the same tomorrow night. So we lose nothing. Do you understand? Someone who is not doing it for the number cannot be beaten by the number." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "But you think it's something, don't you?" And I said, "I think Cordelia did not lie to me, and I think the dates start in the 1850s, and I think a woman who has looked at textiles for 22 years does not set down her coffee for nothing." I refolded the quilt. "But mostly, Julian, I think tomorrow those women are going to have their names said out loud in this house, and it has been a very long time since anybody said them, and that is worth doing, whether it is worth $1 or not." "Camille's going to try to take it," Julian said. "Whatever it is. You know that. I know that," I said. "So what are you going to do?" "Nothing loud," I said. "I'm going to let her hold the door open, and then I'm going to walk through it. Your stepmother has spent 11 years believing that whoever organizes a thing owns it. She's about to organize the very afternoon that proves she never owned any of it." I looked at him. "Julian, when you are dealing with a person who only respects strength, the strongest thing you can do is let them mistake your patience for weakness right up until the moment the truth walks in the door on its own 2 feet. Do you understand me?" "I think so," he said. "You want her to feel safe." "I want her to feel certain," I said. "There is a difference. A person who feels certain stops watching, and a person who stops watching never sees the thing coming." I patted his hand. "Go to bed. Tomorrow's a long day, and you must carry that quilt like it's made of glass, because tomorrow it is." That is the last thing I said to him before the afternoon that changed everything. Let me pause here before I take you into that dining room and ask you something, because I have been carrying this story a long time and I would truly like to know. Have you ever held on to something that everyone around you called worthless, because you knew, in a place deeper than argument, that it mattered? Tell me about it. I mean that. I read every one. Now let me take you into the room. The afternoon came bright and warm. Camille had the dining room glowing. The long walnut table, which normally held a bowl of decorative lemons nobody was allowed to eat, had been cleared and covered with a length of clean white cloth at Eleanor Ash's specific written request. The 11 guests arrived in their good clothes. The woman with the gold watch was there, and she caught my eye and gave me a look I could not quite read, a hungry look, and I understood later it was because Camille had promised her a quilt. The man from the society column had a little notebook, and Camille, in her pale gold dress, stood at the top of that long table, glowing, the picture of a woman about to be confirmed in everything she believed about herself. Eleanor Ashe arrived exactly on time. And she was not what Camille expected. Camille had expected, I think, a genteel appraiser in pearls who would murmur numbers. Eleanor Ashe was a tall, plain, serious woman in her 50s, in a simple dark suit, and she carried a case of tools and a folded pair of white cotton gloves and a small lamp, and she had the manner of a surgeon, not a saleswoman. She shook my hand first, before anyone else's, and she held it a moment, and she said quietly, "Only to me, Mrs. Whitfield. Thank you for letting me come. I have thought about your quilt every day since your grandson's letter." And then she turned to the room and became polite and professional. And Camille, misreading everything, swept forward to take charge. "Welcome, welcome," Camille said. "We are just so thrilled to finally have our family heritage properly documented. As many of you know, I've done extensive research into this family's roots, and I thought it was high time we had the textiles examined as well." She gestured at me, sitting to the side. "Odessa here has been the keeper of these pieces, bless her. And we thought it would be a lovely afternoon to see what we have. So, shall we begin?" Eleanor Ashe looked at Camille for a moment with a still, unreadable expression. Then she said, "Before I begin, I want to be clear with everyone in the room about what I am and am not here to do. I am not an appraiser. I will not be giving you a dollar value today. I am a curator. My job is to read what these objects are trying to tell us. If that is not what you were hoping for, I would rather you know now." I saw Camille's smile flicker. She had wanted a number, in front of her friends. "Of course," she recovered. "But surely you can give us a sense of significance." "Significance," said Eleanor Ashe, "is exactly what I intend to give you." And she asked me, "Only me, Mrs. Whitfield, may I?" "Please," I said. Julian brought the oldest quilt from the garage, carried flat across both arms as Eleanor Ashe had instructed him by phone. And I watched Camille's face as her friends watched a 19-year-old carry in what she had called an old rag and lay it, with enormous care, on a white-clothed table as if it were made of glass. There was a small, uncertain silence in the room. This was not going as Camille had scripted. Eleanor Ashe put on her white gloves. She turned the quilt over, gently, to show the backing, and she set her little lamp low at the edge of the table so its light ran sideways across the cloth, and she bent close. The room leaned in. Even the man with the notebook stopped writing. For a long moment she said nothing. She moved the lamp an inch. She traced the air above the stitching with one gloved finger, not touching. And then Eleanor Ashe, curator of textiles for the State Historical Society, 22 years in the work, drew a slow breath, and I heard it catch, and she said, so softly that the whole room went silent to hear her, "Oh my, what is it?" Camille said, too quickly, "Is it valuable?" Eleanor Ashe did not answer Camille. She looked up, and she looked not at Camille but at me, across all those people, and her eyes were bright, and she said, "Mrs. Whitfield, this is an album, a signature album quilt, and it is signed and dated. May I read them to you? May I read the names?" And I, who had waited 70 years, and one whole spring of being called finished, said, "Yes, please, read them out loud so everyone can hear." Eleanor Ashe bent to the cloth, and she began to read. "Delphia," she said. "Delphia, her hand 1852. She moved her gloved finger to the next block. Patience, Patience Freeman, 1852. She moved again. Charity, then a word I need to study, but I believe it says beloved, then comfort. Then Silence, which was a real given name in that era, a virtue name, Silence. She looked up once, at the ring of faces. These are the makers. Each woman made her block and signed it in her own hand, or had it signed for her if she could not write. This is a community, recorded by itself, in the only archive it was allowed to keep. The room was utterly silent. Camille had gone very still at the head of the table. Eleanor Ashe read on. There is a central block, larger than the others, and it carries an inscription. Give me a moment. She adjusted the lamp, and she read slowly, letting each word fall. To the members of the Female Mutual Aid and Burial Society, this album is offered, that our names not be lost. 1853. She straightened up. Her voice, when it came, was steady and professional, and full of a controlled awe that was more powerful than any excitement. Do you understand what you have here? This is not a decorative quilt. This is the membership record of a mutual aid society of free and enslaved women, made in cloth, because most of these women were forbidden by law to be taught to write, and so the ones who could write signed for the ones who could not. This quilt is a census. It is a burial society ledger. It is quite possibly the only surviving record that these particular women existed at all. There is no courthouse document that names them. There is no photograph. There is this. There is this quilt that has been in your family, Mrs. Whitfield, passed from hand to hand by women who knew, even when they had forgotten the details, that it must not be lost. She turned the quilt with infinite care to show a lower corner. And here, she said, is the line of descent. Do you see? In a different thread, added later and later again. The society's keeper passed it down, and each keeper added her name and the year she received it. This is a chain of custody 2 centuries long, embroidered by the women themselves. She read them. Received by Cordelia. And here, above it, the one who gave it to Cordelia. And below Cordelia, in the newest thread of all, not yet finished, a single name begun and waiting to be completed. She looked up at me. It says, Odessa. Your grandmother stitched your name into the line of keepers, Mrs. Whitfield, before she died. You have been the keeper of this record your whole life. You simply had not been told all of what you were keeping. I will not pretend to you that I stayed composed. I had promised myself I would, and I did not. When Eleanor Ashe read that Cordelia had stitched my name into that long roll of keepers, that she had written me down among all those women who could not write, I put my hand over my mouth, and the tears came, and they were not the tears of a woman who has been wronged. They were the tears of someone who has, after 70 years, finally been told who she is. Julian came and stood behind my chair with his hand on my shoulder. And he was crying too, that gentle boy, and I let it happen in front of all 11 of Camille's guests, because some things are meant to be witnessed. And now I have to turn to Camille. Because Camille had planned this afternoon as her coronation, and instead she was standing at the top of a table where a museum curator was explaining to Camille's own friends, in Camille's own dining room, that the objects Camille had called old rags and shoved next to the lawnmower were a 200-year-old primary historical record of the very ancestry Camille had spent $4,000 and countless lunches bragging about. I watched it land on her in stages. First there was confusion, because this was not the tidy appraisal she had ordered. Then, as Eleanor Ashe said the words primary source and the only surviving record, there was a dawning greedy excitement, because Camille heard significance, and significance meant value. And then, slowly, as that gold-watched guest of Camille's murmured, "My goodness, this belongs in a museum," and as the man with the notebook began writing very fast, Camille began to understand the shape of the trap she had built for herself. Because every guest in that room had, at some point that spring, heard Camille call these quilts Rags. She had said it at her own dinner party. She had said it in front of that same thin friend. And now every one of those people was looking at a national-grade historical treasure and remembering, in real time, that the lady of the house had wanted to throw it in a donation bin. "Well," Camille said. Her voice had climbed half a register. "This is wonderful. This is exactly what I hoped. As I said, the heritage of this family is really quite remarkable, and I'm so glad we've finally documented it properly. Of course, now that we understand its importance, we'll want to make sure it's properly protected. Insured, kept somewhere secure. I've actually already looked into a trust arrangement for the family's textiles, so this is perfect timing." And Eleanor Ashe, who did not know the full history but who was nobody's fool, looked at Camille and said, mildly, "The family's textiles." "Yes," Camille said. "For the whole family. For the children, really, something like this shouldn't be the responsibility of one elderly person alone. Picture this. Camille, in her pale gold dress, at the head of the table, trying to fold my grandmother's quilt into the family's possession, in front of witnesses, before the significance of it had even finished settling in the room. Trying to move it from my hands into her trust while it was still warm from being read. That was Camille. She could not help herself, even in the middle of a genuine wonder, a thing bigger than all of us. She was reaching for the ownership. And this is where I spoke. Not before. I had promised her I would be quiet and let the expert do her thing, and I had kept that promise straight through the reading of the names, but I had never promised to be quiet while she stole them. "Camille," I said. I did not raise my voice. I have never once had to raise my voice in that room, before or since. There is no trust to arrange. And they are not the family's textiles. They are mine. My grandmother willed them directly to me, naming me in writing, over 40 years ago. The paper is in my safe deposit box at the bank. I made copies. I'll be happy to give you one." The room went very quiet. Camille's mouth opened. "Odessa, you don't understand estate matters. This is exactly why we need two. I understand them perfectly," I said. "I was a fabric buyer for 34 years, Camille. I understand documents better than you think. My grandmother Cordelia wrote a will. It is 1 page. It leaves her quilts and her sewing things to me, her granddaughter, witnessed by her pastor and a neighbor. And it has never been contested, because until this afternoon, nobody wanted them. You wanted to set them out for the charity truck in April. You called them old rags at your own dinner table in front of these very people. I expect they remember." I let my eyes travel, gently, around the table, and I saw the guests remember, and I saw that same thin guest look down at her plate. "So there is nothing to place in trust. There is nothing to protect me from. The quilt has been protected for 200 years by women with far less than I have, and it will be fine in my hands a while longer." Eleanor Ashe was watching this with the still attention of someone who has just understood the whole story. And she did a kind thing then, a professional thing, that sealed it. She said to the room, for what it's worth, "From a preservation standpoint, a single clear line of ownership is the most important thing an object like this can have. Divided ownership, trusts, families arguing, that is how records like this get lost, split up, sold off piece by piece. Mrs. Whitfield Holdings' sole documented title to this is the best possible thing for its survival. I would strongly advise against complicating that." She looked at Camille when she said it. Strongly. There was nothing Camille could say. She had built her entire play on the assumption that an old woman's things belonged to whoever organizes them, and the old woman had turned out to have the paper, and the museum had just told the whole room that the old woman keeping the paper was the right and proper thing. She had promised a quilt to her friend. She had called in her own appraiser, in secret, to arrange a trust to protect the family from elderly person issues. And now every guest at that table knew that Camille had wanted to throw away a treasure, and that the only reason it survived was the very woman Camille had spent a spring dismissing. I did not gloat. Understand that, for it was the thing that mattered most to me afterward. I did not say a single cruel word to Camille. I did not have to. The room did it for me, as rooms do, with the small silences and the not-quite-met eyes, and how her thin gold watched guest quietly did not bring up the quilt she had been promised. The reckoning was not a speech I gave. It was the simple fact of the truth, laid on a white cloth in the light, with the names read out loud. Cordelia had been right about that too. "Put your fingers to the cloth," she used to say, "and you will know that somebody once counted you worth a name." The names did the work. I only lit the lamp for them. Now, this story could have ended there, in that dining room, and it would have been enough for me. But it did not end there, and the part that came after is the part I most want you to hear, because it is the part where I found out who was worth keeping and who was not. Eleanor Ashe stayed after the guests had gone. Camille had disappeared upstairs with a headache. Real or performed, I never learned, and Terence hovered in the kitchen doorway, unable to look at me, and it was Julian who made the coffee. Eleanor sat with me at that walnut table for 2 more hours, and she went through all 7 quilts, one by one, and she told me what she could see in each. Most of them, she said, were beautiful ordinary quilts, family pieces, worth loving and worth nothing at auction, and I told her that was fine, that I loved them exactly the same. And she smiled and said she could tell, and that it was rarer than I knew. But 2 of the 7, the album and one other, a story quilt that told, in pictures, a journey north, were, in her words, of genuine national significance. She was careful with me. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "you are under no obligation to do anything with these. They are yours. You could keep them in a chest for the rest of your life, and that would be an entirely honorable choice. I am not here to take them from you. I am here because you asked me who these women were, and I can help you learn." "May I ask you something?" I said, Curator to Keeper. "Of course. In all your years, the ones like this, the real ones, where do they usually come from? When they turn up, who's been keeping them?" Eleanor Ashe lowered her cup, and she thought about it a long moment. "Not from the grand houses," she said finally. "Almost never from the families with the money and the charts. Those families sell things, or divide them, or lose them in a divorce. The real ones come out of a chest in a back bedroom. They come from the poorest branch of the family, the one that couldn't afford to update, the one that never threw anything away because they never had the luxury of deciding what earned its place." She looked at me. "They come from the person everyone else in the family thinks is a little foolish for holding on. That is almost always where I find them, Mrs. Whitfield, in the hands of the one they underestimated." I said nothing to that. There was no need. We both sat there and let it be true. And then she told me what a museum could do, if I ever wished it. Not buy the quilt, she was clear. She was not offering to buy it, because she said a record like this should never really be sold, that selling it was how these things got lost. But a museum could conserve it, stabilize the fragile threads so the names would not fade any further, research the society and identify the women, and, if I chose, display it, with my family named as the source, so that the descendants of every woman in that cloth might one day walk in and find their own people written down. "You would be able to give them back to everyone they belonged to," Eleanor said. "Not just your family, All of the families. Every name in that quilt has descendants somewhere who do not know these women existed. You are holding the only door to them. I did not decide that afternoon. Let me be honest about that, because I know the temptation of the story is to have the old woman announce a grand gift on the spot. Real life is slower and better than that. I took a long time. I talked to Julian. I sat with the quilts in the garage on many evenings. I prayed about it, in my quiet way, which for me has always been less asking and more listening. And in the end, months later, I made a decision. And you shall hear what it was. But first, you should know what Camille did next. Because Camille was not finished, and how a person behaves after they have been humbled tells you everything about who they really are. For about a week after the afternoon, Camille was silent and cold, and I left her to it. Then she changed strategy again, because Camille always had another strategy. She became, suddenly, my dearest advocate. She began telling people, the same committee, the same friends, a new version of events in which she had always known the quilts were treasures, in which she had personally arranged for the museum to come and authenticate the family's heritage, in which she was the guardian of a national treasure. She rewrote the whole spring. In Camille's new telling, old rags had never been said, and if it had been said, it had been a joke. And really, it had been her research and her initiative that had brought the museum to the door. She began referring to the album Quilt, in company, as our family's document, as if calling an appraiser behind my back to arrange a trust had never happened. And I let that story stand, for a while, because I have learned that a person who has to rewrite the story that recently is a person the truth is still chewing on, and there is no need to interrupt that particular meal. But then Camille did the thing that ended it between us. The thing I could not let stand, and I will set down exactly what it was, for it is the hinge of everything that came after. Camille contacted Eleanor Ashe, behind my back. Again, she called the Historical Society, represented herself as the family spokesperson for the Whitfield textiles, and began discussing the terms of a family loan or gift of the album Quilt to the museum, including, and Eleanor told me this herself, gently, because Eleanor had grown protective of me, a discussion of whether the family might receive recognition, a naming, perhaps a small stipend or a tax consideration, in exchange for the gift. Camille was trying to give away my quilt to a museum under the family banner and collect the credit and possibly the benefit for it. She had failed to control it through a trust, so she was going to control it through generosity, other people's generosity, mine, wearing it as her own. Eleanor Ashe, God bless her 22 years of dealing with families, had said to Camille only, "I'll need to hear that directly from Mrs. Whitfield, as she holds sole title." And then she had picked up the phone and called me. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I don't want to cause trouble in your family, but I felt you should know that a woman calling herself your family's spokesperson has been discussing the disposition of your quilt with my office, and I wanted to make sure that was your wish and not a surprise." It was a surprise. And it was the last one Camille got to give me. I thanked Eleanor, and I told her plainly that no one but me had any authority over that quilt, and that any call from any spokesperson should be disregarded, and she said she had assumed as much and was glad to have it confirmed. And then I sat in the garage for a long time with the quilt across my knees, just as Cordelia used to sit, and I ran my finger along that stitched roll of keepers, along the newest thread where my grandmother had begun my name and not finished it, and I decided that the time for quiet had ended. Not for spite, for clarity. Camille had mistaken my silence for weakness one too many times. And a boundary that is never stated out loud is a boundary a person like Camille will step over every single time. I asked Terence and Camille to sit down with me at the walnut table one evening, the same table where the names had been read. Julian was there. I had asked him to be. I laid two things on the white cloth. One was the copy of Cordelia's will, the single page, the one that left the quilts to me by name. The other was a plain sheet of paper on which I had written, in my own hand, exactly what I intended to do, so that there could be no rewriting of it later. Camille, I said, you called the museum and told them you speak for this family about my quilt. You don't. Nobody does but me. I want to say this once, and I want your husband and your son to hear me say it, so it is never in question again. I laid my hand flat on the will. This quilt, and the story quilt, and the other 5 are mine, not the family's. Mine. My grandmother left them to me, and I have carried them through a flood and a fire and 34 years of working for other people, and I never carried them all that way to hand them to a woman who wanted to throw them in the trash in April and take the credit for them in June. Camille started to speak. Odessa, I only ever wanted to protect. You wanted to control, I said. Not sharply, just true. In April, you controlled by calling them rags and putting them in the garage, because worthless things can be discarded and you get to be the one who decides. In May, when you learned they might be worth money, you controlled by talking about trusts and appraisers and elderly person issues, because valuable things must be managed and you get to be the manager. And now, in June, you're controlling by generosity, by trying to give away my quilt in the family's name so you can be the woman who gave a treasure to a museum. It's the same reach every time, Camille, only the glove changes. That's not fair, Camille said at last. I have given 11 years to this family. I organized everything. I planned the move. I did the research nobody else bothered to do. And now, because of some old blanket, I'm the villain? You're not the villain, Camille, I said. You're a woman who prices things. That's not a crime. It's just a smaller way to live than you think it is. You looked at a 200-year-old record of the dead, and the only question you could form was what it was worth. And when you thought the answer was nothing, you wanted to throw it away. And when you thought the answer was a lot, you wanted to lock it up. And at no point, not once, did it occur to you to simply ask whose names those were. I kept my voice gentle, because gentleness was the sharpest tool I had. That's the whole difference between us. I never once asked what it was worth, and it turned out to be worth everything. You always ask what it's worth, and you keep ending up with nothing you can hold. That's a very pretty speech, Camille said, and her voice had gone thin. You've clearly been saving it. I have, I said, 60 years, give or take. I have never seen Camille without words after that. She sat there in her chair, and her mouth worked, and nothing came. And I turned to my son, Terence, I said. I need to say something to you, and it is harder than anything I said to your wife, because you are mine and she is not. My voice did not shake. I had practiced it, honestly, alone in the garage, until it would not shake. The night of your wife's dinner party, I heard you in the kitchen. I heard her say the quilts should belong to the whole family and not to me alone. And I heard you say, my son, that she was right, that they were everyone's now, not simply mine. You said that about the things I ran into a burning house to save, while your father begged me not to. You said that the same week you learned they might be worth money, and not 1 week before, when they were only worth love. I let it sit. I raised you better than that, Terence. I know I did, because I remember the boy who wore the same coat 2 winters, so I could put the money toward the little house, and never once complained. That boy knew the difference between what a thing costs and what it's worth. I don't know when you forgot it. but I need you to remember it now." And my son, my Terence, put his face in his hands at that table, and he wept. Not the polite way. The real way, how a grown man weeps when the truth of what he has become catches up with him all at once. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, into his hands. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how I just went along. I always just went along." He looked up, and he looked, for a moment, exactly like the boy in the 2-winter coat. "You ran into a fire for that box. I remember. Dad told me 100 times. And I stood in my own kitchen and called it the family's like it was a dining set." He shook his head. "That's not who you raised." "You're right. That's not who you raised." "Then let me ask you something, son," I said, "and answer me honest, like you did when you were small and couldn't lie to save your life. When did you last feel like the boy in that coat? When did you last feel like the person your father and I raised?" He was quiet a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "A while. A long while." "And whose house are we sitting in?" He looked around that dining room, at the long walnut top, at the cleared surface where a bowl of lemons nobody could eat usually sat. "Camille's," he said quietly. "It was always Camille's. Even the parts I paid for." "I'm not going to say a word against your wife," I told him. "That's not my place, and it's not why I called you to this table. But I'll say this once, and then never again. A person who sorts a quilt into the giveaway pile is a person who is always sorting. And sooner or later, everyone in that person's house ends up in one pile or another. You've been in the giveaway pile a long time, Terence. You just didn't have the word for it until you watched her do it to something you knew was priceless." I reached across and took his hand. "I found my word this spring. I hope you find yours. That's all I'll say. Now I owe you the plain truth about Camille and Terence, because this audience does not want a fairy tale, it wants the truth. And the truth is that people do not all change equally. Terence changed. It took him time, and it took more than one hard conversation, and I will tell you where he ended up. But Camille did not change. Camille, faced with a husband weeping over his mother's forgiveness, sat at that table, and I watched her recalculate, and I saw the exact moment she decided that this new arrangement, this Terence, who had remembered his mother, was going to be a problem for her, and that she would need a strategy for it. Some people, when the truth comes into the room, are humbled by it. Other people simply start looking for the exit the truth is standing in front of. Camille was the second kind. I had known it for 11 years. Now, Terence knew it too, and that knowledge, which I never once spoke aloud to him, was the beginning of the end of a marriage I had watched shrink my son for over a decade. But I am getting ahead of the story again. Let me go back and tell you the sacrifice, the real backstory, the thing that the quilts were really about, because you cannot understand why I did what I finally did with them unless you understand what Cordelia gave me, and what I nearly lost, and how close those names came to being lost forever. I told you my mother died young. What I left out is how young I was. I was 6, and there was a stretch, before Cordelia took me in for good, when I was passed among relatives who did not want another mouth. And I learned, at 6 and 7 and 8 years old, exactly what it feels like to be an old rag yourself. A thing that gets shifted from one household to the next, because nobody has decided you are worth keeping. I know that feeling from the inside. That is why Camille's word landed as hard as it did. When she held up my grandmother's quilt and called it an old rag fit only for the giveaway pile, she was, without knowing it, describing a little girl I used to be. It was Cordelia who ended that. She came for me the winter I turned 9, in a borrowed car, and she took me to the frame house with the wood stove and the sewing window, and she never sent me anywhere again. And on my first night there, I remember, I could not sleep. Because in every other house sleeping had meant being sent away in the morning. And Cordelia came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she laid the album quilt over me, this quilt, the one that was read on the walnut table 62 years later, and she said, "You feel that weight? That's not just a blanket. That's a whole society of women holding you down so you can't blow away." Every one of them was written down because she mattered. And now, you're under them, so you matter too. Go to sleep. And I slept. For the first time in 3 years, I slept a whole night, under the names of women I would not learn until my 71st year. Women who could not write, but who made sure they would not be forgotten, holding down a little girl who was afraid she would be. That is what Camille called an old rag. So you understand, when Eleanor Ashe read those names aloud on the walnut table, she was not just reading history to me. She was reading the roll call of everyone who had ever held me down so I would not blow away. Back to before there were cameras. Back to women who signed for each other because half of them were forbidden to learn their letters. Delphia, patience, charity, comfort, silence. And in the newest thread, unfinished, Odessa. I had spent my whole life afraid, in some deep 6-year-old place, that I was disposable. And here was proof, in cloth, 200 years old, that I had been written down before I was ever born, into a line of women who did not let their people be lost. Now do you see why I could not let Camille lock it in a trust for the children? Now do you see why the number never once mattered to me? Camille thought the quilt was worth $60,000. She was wrong. It was worth a night's sleep to a terrified child, and it was worth the same thing to hundreds of children she had never met, and never would, whose great-great-grandmothers were in that cloth, waiting, unnamed in every other record on earth, to be found. That is a value that has no number. And a woman who only speaks in numbers can never hold it, no matter whose name is on the trust. I sat with the decision all summer, as I told you. And here is what I decided, and here is where the story turns from a reckoning into something I hope is larger than a reckoning. Because the reference for this kind of story is that the good woman punishes the bad woman and walks off richer. And I did walk off richer, though not by how Camille measured it. But you should see that the real ending was not about Camille at all. The real ending was about the names. I called Eleanor Ashe in September, and I gave her my decision. I would not sell the album quilt, and I would not lock it in a trust, and I refused to keep it hidden in a chest until I died, and let it become the subject of a family fight over my body before it was cold. I meant to give it to the museum. Not in the family's name, in the name of that old burial society itself, so that the credit went to the women who made it and not to any of the living. I asked only 3 things. First, that the quilt be conserved so the names would not fade further, so that Patience, Delphia, and all the rest of them would outlast me by another 200 years. Second, that the society research the names and, wherever a living descendant could be found, that descendant be invited, personally, to come and see their people written down. And third, one thing for myself, that the keeper's record on the back be completed. That my name, which Cordelia had begun and not finished, be finished, in thread, by the museum's conservator, so that the record would show truthfully that the quilt passed through my hands too, and that I was the one who brought it home to everyone it belonged to. Eleanor Ashe was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Mrs. Whitfield, in 22 years I have never had anyone ask me to finish their own name in the keeper's roll. Most people ask about the value, or the tax deduction, or whether they can keep a reproduction. She paused. You're asking to be sewn in. Do you know how rare that is? You are the only person I have ever met who understood, before I said a word, that the point was never to own it. The point was to keep it, and then to pass it on. My grandmother told me, I said, a long time ago. I just took a while to hear the whole of it. The gift was made in the autumn. There was a small ceremony at the Historical Society, and I should name for you who was there. Because who is in a room at the end of a story is the whole moral of it. Eleanor Ashe was there, of course, and her conservator, a young woman with the same careful hands. Julian was there, in his one good jacket, standing very straight. Terence was there, and he had by then begun the quiet work of becoming his mother's son again, and he wept again, but this time they were not shamed tears. They were proud ones. And there were 7 strangers there, 7 people the Society's researchers had found in 8 weeks of work, 7 living descendants of women in that quilt who had grown up, every one of them, not knowing their people's names, and who stood in front of a lighted case and read, for the first time in their lives, the name of a great-great-great-grandmother who had signed her block in 1852 because she refused to be forgotten. One of them, an old man older than me, put his hand flat on the glass over the name Patience Freeman, and he could not speak, and he did not have to, and I knew exactly what that hand on the glass was doing. Because Cordelia had taught me, when you don't know where you come from, you lay your hand on this, and you'll know somebody thought you were worth writing down. Camille was not there. She had not been forbidden. She simply did not come, because there was no credit in it for her. No committee to impress, no number to name. And that, more than anything I could have said, told the truth about the difference between us. I gave the most valuable thing my family owned away for free, in the name of women long gone, and Camille could not find a reason to attend an event where she would not be the story. Terence noticed her absence. He did not say much about it. But I saw him notice, and I watched that noticing settle into him, and it was one more thread in the unraveling. Now for how it ended for Camille, because this audience has followed her a long way and deserves the accounting. I said before that people do not all change equally. Camille did not change. Over that autumn and the following winter, freed a little from his mother's shadow and a little from his own shame, Terence began, after 11 long years, to see his wife clearly. He saw how she had handled the quilts, and once you have seen a person handle one thing like that, you begin to see them handle everything like that. He saw how she treated the caterer and the cleaner, and eventually, he told me later, how she had been treating him. Camille had spent 11 years deciding what in Terence's life earned its place, and what got quietly carried to the curb. And Terence had spent 11 years being sorted, the same way I had been sorted in April, and he had simply never had the word for it until he watched her do it to a quilt. I did not tell my son to leave his wife. I want to be very clear about that, because it would be an easy and a false ending to say that the wronged mother broke up the marriage. I did not. I have never believed in that. What I did was refuse to be dismissed, out loud, once at a walnut table with a paper in my hand. And it turned out that a boundary, once one person in a house sees it drawn and survives the drawing, becomes a thing other people in the house start to imagine drawing too. Terence drew his the following spring, a year after the move. It was quiet. It was sad, as these things are sad. There were no quilts in it, and no museums. But I do not think it is a coincidence that my son found the words to say enough to his own life the same year he watched his mother find the words to say mine. Camille landed on her feet as her kind always do. She kept the house, or most of it, and the club, and the committee, and she tells, I am told, a version of her life in which she is the injured party and the family did not appreciate her taste. She still, I am told, mentions on occasion that her former husband's family had a quilt in a museum. She cannot help it. Even now, even out, she reaches for the credit of the thing she once called a rag. I feel, when I hear this, something I did not expect to feel, which is not triumph and not anger, but a kind of tired tenderness. What you feel toward a person who is standing in a warm house, insisting they are cold. Camille will always be cold. She measures everything, and the things that matter most cannot be measured, and so she will spend her whole life certain she has been cheated. Sitting on a fortune of numbers, freezing, I would not trade one night's sleep under those names for everything Camille owns. And I think, in her clearest and most frightened moments, Camille knows it. That is punishment enough. There was no need to add to it, and I did not. Now I should say where I am, so you are not left worrying about the old woman in the story. I did not move back into the house that was not mine, and I never stayed in Camille's beige guest room. Terence and Julian and I found a small place, 1 story, no bad stairs, with a good north window that I use, I am not ashamed to tell you, as a sewing window. Julian is there most weekends. He is studying, still, the things with computers, and he has decided he wants to work in what he calls digital preservation, which as far as I can tell means he wants to spend his life doing for other people's records what he did for mine in that garage with a lamp. I could not be prouder. He is the 4th generation, in a way, of a boy in a 2-winter coat who knew the difference between what a thing costs and what it's worth. And here is the part I saved for last, because it is the part that undoes me still. On the day I signed the papers giving the album Quilt to the museum, Eleanor Ash's conservator, the young woman with the careful hands, asked me a question. She began, Mrs. Whitfield, the line of keepers is meant to continue. You've asked us to finish your name. But a record like this doesn't end with the person who gives it to the institution. Traditionally, the keeper names her successor, the one who will carry the memory even after the object is safe. Is there someone you would like recorded as the next keeper? I did not even have to think. Julian, I said. My grandson. Write down Julian. The young woman wrote it down, and Julian, standing beside me, went very still the way he does, his grandfather's stillness, and then he said, quietly, You don't have to do that, Grandma. I didn't do anything. I just borrowed a lamp. You turned on the light, I said. That is the whole job, Julian. That has always been the whole job. Somebody sews the names. Somebody keeps the cloth. And somebody, in every generation, has to be the one who turns on the light so the next person can read them. Your great-great-grandmother sewed. Cordelia kept. I carried the lamp this time. Now it's written down that it'll be you next. I put my hand on his arm. That's not a burden I'm giving you. It's the opposite of a burden. It's the thing that told a scared little girl in a borrowed bed that she mattered. I'm giving you the light. He did not say anything to that. He just put his hand over mine on his arm, and we stood there in front of the lighted case, and I thought about how strange and good it was that the meanest thing anyone ever said about my family, old rags, belongs in the trash, had led, step by step, to this, to Julian's name stitched among the keepers, to 7 strangers with their hands on the glass, to Delphia and patience and charity and comfort and silence, conserved now, their thread stabilized, safe for 2 more centuries, read at last. Camille had meant to see the quilt hauled off with the trash. Instead she had, without ever intending to, been the grain of sand that made the whole thing happen. If she had simply let the box sit in the garage, I might never have gone looking. It was her contempt that lit the fuse of my resolve. I have thought about that many times, and I have decided it is one of the quiet jokes God likes to tell. That the person who tries hardest to bury a thing is so often the one who ends up planting it. There is the appraiser Camille sent, that estate service man, and his afternoon told me everything about the two ways of looking at a thing, and it is the clearest illustration I know of what this whole story was really a fight between. He came on a Thursday, 3 days before Eleanor Ashe was due, arranged by Camille behind my back, and Julian let him into the garage because Julian had learned from me that you find out more by opening the door than by slamming it. The man was pleasant enough. He wore a good watch and he had a little device for measuring the age of fabric and a way of speaking that turned everything into a category. He looked at the album quilt for perhaps 4 minutes. He held one corner to the light. He rubbed the cotton between his fingers, which made me wince, and he said cotton, hand-pieced, some water damage, condition fair to poor. The signature work is interesting. Could bump it for a collector who likes the folk primitive look. Honestly, in this condition, at auction, you're looking at maybe 800, 900, 1,200 if you find the right buyer. The stains really hurt you. He set it down and made a note. The others are worth less. I'd say the lot, maybe 2,000, 2,500 on a good day. My advice, if the family wants to clean this up, is quiet sale, private buyer. Avoid the fees. Julian, God bless him, said only, "Thank you, we'll think about it," and showed him out, and did not tell him one single thing about the names. And later, when I asked Julian why he had not corrected the man, why he had not said, "Sir, those stains you keep mentioning are the marks of 200 years of women keeping this alive," Julian said something I have kept ever since. He said, "Because he wasn't looking at it, Grandma, he was pricing it." You can't correct a person who's pricing something. You can only wait for a person who's willing to look. That boy was 19. $2,000, the pricing man said. And 3 days later, a woman who was willing to look sat at the same table and called it a primary source that history had tried hardest to forget. And the difference between those two numbers is the difference between Camille and me, and it is the whole story in a single garage. I keep coming back to those 34 years too, and I want to lay them out for you plainly, as this audience likes, because a sacrifice that is not counted is a sacrifice nobody believes. 34 years I worked as a fabric buyer downtown. I chose the cloth that other people sold at a markup and called their own good taste. I raised Terrence on that salary, alone, after Elias's heart gave out when the boy was 14. I paid for the 2 winter coat, and then the better coat, and then the community college that Camille later described at a luncheon as not a real school. I carried the cedar chest up to the attic myself in the flood, 7 months along with Terrence, 1 step at a time, because Elias was at work and the water was rising, and there was no one else, and there was no question in my mind that the chest was going up even if I had to go up with it. And 9 years later I ran back into a burning house for it, past a fireman who tried to stop me, and I came out with my eyebrows singed, and the chest in my arms, and Elias screaming my name in the yard. And when he held me after, shaking, and said, "Odessa, it's a box of blankets, you could have died for a heap of old cloth," I said to him the truest thing I have ever said to anyone. I said, "Elias, it is not a box of blankets. It is the only people who ever wanted me before you did. I would not leave them in a fire twice." He never argued with me about the chest again. He told that story to Terrence 100 times, and Terrence forgot it for 1 bad week in June, and then he remembered it. And that is a man's whole redemption, right there, remembering the thing his father told him 100 times. I want to go back, before I bring this to a close, and tell you about one afternoon right in the thick of it, because it is my favorite part of the whole story and it never made it into the society column or the museum's records. It was late that summer, after I had made my decision, but before the ceremony, and one of the 7 descendants the researchers had found came to see me. She was a woman about my own age, and her great-great-grandmother's name was one of the ones on the quilt, and she drove 3 hours to sit at my little table and drink coffee and look at a photograph of her ancestor's stitched signature, because the quilt itself was already at the conservators. She held that photograph in both hands for a long time, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "My whole life, my family said we came from nobody, that there was no record, that the line just stopped, that we were the kind of people history didn't write down." She touched the photograph. And here she is. She wrote herself down. She wrote herself down in the one book they couldn't take away from her because it looked like a blanket. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "How did you know to keep it? For all those years, when everyone told you it was nothing." And I gave her the truth. I said, I didn't know what it was. I'll be honest with you, I couldn't even read most of the names until my grandson brought a lamp to it. I kept it because my grandmother told me to, and because when I was a little girl who thought she came from nobody too, that quilt was the first thing that ever made me feel like I came from somebody. I didn't keep it because I knew it was valuable. I kept it because it kept me. She reached across my little table and took my hand, this stranger, who was not a stranger, whose great-great-grandmother had signed her block right next to a woman who had signed for the woman who signed for the woman who eventually signed for Cordelia. And she said, "Then it kept us both." And we sat there, 2 old women in a small kitchen with its bright north window, holding hands over a photograph of a woman 2 centuries gone, and I tell you, I have been to church my whole life, and I have felt the presence of God in many rooms, and I felt it in that one, as plain as the coffee going cold between us. There is one more thing from the afternoon of the reading that I held back, and I saved it because it was the moment I understood that Camille would never be able to touch me again. After Eleanor Ashe had read the Makers, and the central inscription, and the roll of keepers, one of the guests, a quiet man who had said nothing all afternoon, asked her a question. He said, "Miss Ashe, forgive me, but how do you know it's genuine? Couldn't someone have sewn these names in recently to make it seem old?" It was a fair question, and I held my breath, because Camille sat up straight, hoping. Eleanor Ashe smiled. The first real smile I had seen from her all day. "A wonderful question," she said. "And the answer is why I set down my coffee." She lifted the edge with her gloved hand. "You cannot fake this. The thread used for the names is period thread, hand-spun, and it is aged into the fabric at the same rate as the fabric itself, which takes a century or more and cannot be imitated. The dyes are period dyes. The spelling and the letter forms are consistent with the region and the decade. And here," she pointed, "the ink used for the 2 blocks that were signed in ink rather than thread has migrated into the cloth in a pattern that only occurs over 150 years or more. This was not made to look old. This is old." And more than that, she looked around the table. No forger would ever fake this. Because until about 10 years ago, nobody knew these were valuable. For most of this quilt's life, it was worth nothing on any market. Nobody fakes a thing that isn't worth money. This survived precisely because it was considered worthless. It survived in a chest, in an attic, through a flood and a fire, kept by women who valued it for reasons that had nothing to do with money at all. And she looked then directly at me, and she said, to the whole room, but really to me, That is the only reason records like this ever survive. Someone has to love the thing before the world decides it's worth loving. Someone has to keep it through the years when keeping it looks like foolishness. The quiet man nodded slowly, and Camille, who had wanted him to catch me out, sat there having instead heard a curator explain to 11 witnesses that the quilt survived only because someone loved it when it was worthless, and every single person at that table knew, without it being said, which someone that was, and which someone had called it a rag. Camille had asked, in effect, for proof, and the proof had been the story of my whole life. That was the moment. Not the money, not the will, not the boundary I drew later at the walnut table. That was the moment I knew I had already won, months before, in a burning house, with the chest in my arms, when I decided a thing's worth was not for other people to tell me. That is what Camille called old rags. That is what she wanted to set out for the charity truck. That is what my son, for one bad week, called the family's and not just mine. And that is why, when people ask me if I am angry at Camille, I find that I am not really, not anymore. Anger is for people who took something from you. Camille did not take anything from me. She tried, 3 times, in 3 different gloves, and she failed every time, and in failing she handed me the occasion to do the most important thing I have ever done. You cannot stay angry at someone who, trying to rob you, accidentally handed you the keys to the vault. You can only shake your head and forgive them, and go on being the keeper of the light. I do want to say one more true thing about dignity, because I think it is the thing this whole story is really about, and I do not want you to miss it under all the drama of the museum and the reckoning. When Camille held up that quilt and called it a rag, the temptation, the very human temptation, was to snatch it back and shout its worth at her. To say, "Do you know what this is? Do you know what you are holding, you fool?" And if I had done that, in April, with no proof, no curator, no lamp, no reading of the names, I would have been just an angry old woman clutching a blanket and insisting it was treasure, and Camille would have won. Because Camille was very, very good at making sure the angry old woman was the story. The dignity lived in the waiting. It lived in letting her believe she had won, in saying I'll keep them in the garage, and helping her choose linens for the very afternoon that undid her. The dignity was in refusing to argue about the quilt's worth, and instead simply, patiently, arranging for its worth to be spoken aloud by a voice Camille could not shout down, in a light Camille could not turn off, in front of witnesses Camille had invited herself. I did not win by being louder than Camille. I won by being quieter, and by knowing where the paper was, and by trusting that the truth, given a lamp and a witness and enough time, does not need me to yell for it. It only needs me to keep it, and to turn on the light, and to get out of its way. That is the whole of what Cordelia taught me, over 60 years. In one sentence I did not understand, until I was 71. Keep the cloth. Turn on the light. Step aside for the names. Your value is not in whether the loud people in the room can see it. Your value was stitched in before you were born, by hands that could not even write their letters, into the one book they could not be forbidden. And no daughter-in-law with a laminated chart and a donation bin can take that from you, because she does not have the pen, and she never did, and she never will. The quilt hangs now in a lighted case at the museum. There is a small card beside it. It does not say my name first. It says, at my request, the name of the Female Mutual Aid and Burial Society, 1853, and then it lists the makers, all of them, Delphia and Patience and Charity and Comfort and Silence and the others, and then, in smaller letters, it names the keepers, one by one, ending with a woman who brought it home to everyone it belonged to, and beneath that the next keeper, whose name is Julian. I go and sit with it sometimes. There is a bench. Julian comes with me when he can. And I watch strangers walk up to it and read the names, and every so often I watch one of them go, still, and put a hand near the glass, and I know, without asking, that they have just found their people, that they have just learned that somebody 200 years ago counted them worth a name. And I think every single time that a rag cannot do that. Only a record can. Only a keeper can. Only the light can. If this story has touched your heart, sit with something before you go. I have told you a story about a quilt, but you know it was never really about a quilt. It was about whether you get to decide your own worth, or whether you let the loudest, most polished person in the room decide it for you. Camille had a chart she bought and a house full of things that earned their place. My grandmother had a blanket full of the dead and a granddaughter she taught to keep the light. And I know which one of us slept better, and I know which one of us they will be reading about in 200 years, and it is not the one with the chart. So here is what I would love to know from you, and I mean it, because the comments on these stories are a kind of guest book, and I read every single one. Have you ever had someone in your own family dismiss the thing you treasured most, only for its true worth to be revealed later? Or have you kept something yourself, a recipe, a Bible, a photograph, a story, that everyone else called worthless, and you kept it anyway, because you knew? I would love to hear which one you are, the one who was doubted, or the one who kept the light. Tell me your story, and tell me where you are watching from, and what time it is in your part of the world, so we can all sit together at this table a while longer. And if you have felt, even once, like an old rag that got moved from house to house because nobody decided you were worth keeping, I want you to hear me, from an old woman who felt exactly that at 6 years old and found out at 71 that she had been written down before she was born. You were written down too. Somebody, somewhere back down the line, kept the light for you. Whether you have found the cloth yet or not, go and look for it. And when you find it, keep it and turn it on and step aside for the names. Because your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. It was stitched in long before they ever showed up, and it will be read aloud long after they are gone. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of your people. Keep the light.